Do you know your Shoggoths from your Yog-Sothoth? Can you spot the Innsmouth look at 100 yards? And have you ever gone into your local library to search for the Necronomicon? If the answer to any of those is yes, you're in the right place, because today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at my top 5 Lovecraft films. Hi, I'm Rob Poynton. Thanks for joining me today on Dragon's Teeth, where, yes, I'm taking a look at my 5 top Lovecraft films, and I'm sticking pretty much to films that are based on Lovecraft stories rather than Lovecraftian films. H.P. Lovecraft, of course, who was writing in the 1920s, 1930s, has been described as the father of cosmic horror. I don't think we can say that he invented the genre, because there were people before him like William Hope Hodgson, Robert Chambers, to some extent people like Machen, maybe even Poe. But what Lovecraft did was, I think, really change the face of horror, and he brought it into the 20th century. Up to that point, horror had largely been based around the Gothic, the idea of vengeful ghosts, vampires, perhaps werewolves, that kind of thing. In other words, people coming up against the supernatural. Lovecraft switched away from that, and rather than have his works based on supernatural, they were based on, well, alien entities. So there's this discussion about whether Lovecraft is horror or science fiction. Of course, back in the day, it was all called weird fiction or speculative fiction or even just fantasy. So as far as what's become as the Cthulhu mythos goes, what Lovecraft created was a world or a universe where humanity is not at the centre, unlike the more traditional Gothic stories. In the mythos, we have these entities around us. Some are from other places, they're alien life forms, some are from other dimensions, and although people might try and worship them or contact them in some way, the basic premise is that they're not even really aware of our existence. And if they are, we're nothing more than ants might be to a human. This then is a very materialistic, nihilistic, bleak and uncaring universe. This is not the universe where you can hold up a symbol of your faith and it will protect you from evil. In fact, in Lovecraft, there's not really even the concepts of good and evil. The universe is as it is. So I think this was quite groundbreaking stuff for the time, and they're gathered around people like Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, a circle of writers with similar ideas. So Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, Donald Wandrei, Frank Belknap Long, August Erleth, they became what was known as the Lovecraft Circle. And when Lovecraft died, his vision, if you like, his work was continued. Because one very important thing with Lovecraft and all these writers is that they shared their creations. There was no defensiveness about, Cthulhu is my creation, you can't use him. All the other writers would mention Cthulhu in their stories as well. So what you then get is this almost myth cycle build up, to the extent that readers of Weird Tales and other pulp magazines were actually writing in and asking, is the Necronomicon a real book? Because it was being cross-referenced by so many writers. Lovecraft's influence continued to grow, particularly with the paperback boom in the 60s and 70s, and it's been a major influence on people like Ramsey Campbell, Thomas Ligotti, Stephen King, and so on. And of course, Lovecraft had a huge influence on gaming. Gary Gygax quoted him in Appendix N as Dungeons and Dragons as being an influence on that. And in 1981, I think it was, we of course got Call of Cthulhu from Chaosium, which gave us a bold new approach to RPGs, this investigative sort of format where you can come up against the horrors of the mythos. From there, it's just continued to spread. So today we've got graphic novels, we've got anthologies, we've got books, we've got video games, we've got podcasts, And we've even got events as well, such as the Necronomicon in the US and our very own Innsmouth Literary Festival. And of course, on top of all that, we have a whole range of Lovecraft movies. Now, when it comes to filming Lovecraft, you're up against quite a few problems. The first thing is that Lovecraft didn't really do characters. There's only one or two recurring characters in his books, and well, one of those, Randolph Carter, is really just a cipher for Lovecraft himself. It's not really into character development. The whole thing with Lovecraft is about building this atmosphere. Similar in some ways perhaps to M.R. James, where you start off with things that are quite normal, but gradually these strange little elements are introduced and they build up until the final horror is revealed. And the way this is presented in Lovecraft is obviously through the eyes of the protagonist. Quite often it's a sole protagonist. You occasionally get small groups, but really a lot of the way the horror is expressed is by someone explaining their attempt to grasp this new reality, or to grasp the fact that their old reality has just crumbled, has just sort of disappeared before their eyes. Now, that can be quite difficult to get across on film because you're talking about a person's internal dialogue, you're talking about their feelings, how they're seeing something. And of course, as part of that, in Lovecraft, there's very little in the way of interpersonal relationships. There's certainly no love interest, for example. You get groups of people come together at a certain time, they might be investigating something, or more likely, they've got a call from their friend saying something horrible has happened. Can you come and help me? Quite often they end up shooting the friend. So you see where this is going in terms of character development, in terms of interpersonal dynamics and relationships in a movie. It's quite tough to get that from Lovecraft. Added to that, except in a few cases, the Shadow over Innsmouth being the most notable, sometimes there's not even a lot of action. This was something that people like Lovecraft and Smith often got criticised for by the publishers who were sort of publishing them at the time. We need more action in our stories. People want to see gunfights. People want to see fistfights and this kind of thing, which neither of them was really into because, as I say, everything is about atmosphere and it's more about this fracturing of reality for the people in the story. Having said that, we do get some action, as I said, in Lovecraft, and this is probably why the best films or the best adaptations of Lovecraft are those stories that contain some form of action. And finally, of course, we come to the horrors of the mythos themselves. Lovecraft is often criticised as saying, oh, it was indescribable. I saw something and it was indescribable, and he doesn't say any more. I don't think that's really fair because he often goes into quite a lot of detail in describing what Cthulhu looks like, what the Shoggoth looks like, certainly what the Deep Ones look like in the Shadow over Innsmouth. But part of the issue there is if you're looking at a multi-dimensional being, you can only see it in 3 dimensions, whereas it might exist in 6 or 7 or 8. So we get this idea again of the brain struggling to come to terms with this new version of reality. So the brain will fall back on, oh, it sort of looks like a shark crossed with a squid with spider legs and a bit of a sort of bat wings. You know, it's the brain trying to make sense of what it's seeing. Now, that's great on the page because you can create your own picture. On film, of course, it's this old thing, right? As soon as you show the whole monster, then the spell is broken. So one of the great things about the first Alien film, for example, was just these little glimpses you get of it. I can't remember exactly when in the film you see the alien in all its glory, but you've got this lovely build-up. Of course, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So how, as a filmmaker, do you approach that problem? Well, we're going to find out because each of the films I'm talking about contains at least one Lovecraftian monstrosity in all its glory. So let's crack on and we'll start with number 5. The Dunwich Horror was released in 1970. It stars Dean Stockwell as Wilbur Whately, Sandra Dee as Nancy Wagner, and Ed Begley as Dr. Henry Armitage. The Dunwich Horror, of course, is the story of Wilbur Whately, who was born in the Whately farm in rural Dunwich. And, well, let's say he was quite an unusual chap. By the age of 4, he was about 6 foot tall or something, and the Whateleys themselves had a sinister reputation around town. The film does make some major changes. For a start, Wilbur, as played by Dean Stockwell, looks totally human. Now, granted, Stockwell makes the character a little bit odd. He's got some funny occult rings, is often making strange hand gestures, and is quite an intense young man, but he certainly doesn't look anything like the Wilbur in the book. What also changes, of course, is because this is a movie, we have Sandra Dee as a sort of love interest. And the plot changes from the story as well, in that Dee is basically there as the virgin sacrifice because Wilbur wants to create a ritual to open the portal to bring the great old ones back and take over the earth. So in that sense, it almost goes back to one of those devil rides out or Satanists trying to do a sacrifice kind of plots, with a bit of an addition of tentacles thrown in. It is very much of its time, but I think it has a certain charm. I do like this film. We get Wilbur's twin in this, seen briefly now and again, as a kind of psychedelic monster. It goes full psychedelic, and there's the tentacles and some swishy sounds and everything else. I thought that worked pretty well. And of course, we get some nudity. The ritual, or Wilbur's followers, his cultists, are very hippie-like. But we are in 1970. I guess we've had the Manson thing going on and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite typical of its time as far as that goes. And I think a lot of this is probably down to the fact that it was directed by Roger Corman, of course, famous for all those old Poe UIP films, Mask of the Red Death, Fall of the House of Usher, and so on. And the director, Daniel Haller, had also just previously made Diet Monster Diet with Boris Karloff, which again is based roughly on another Lovecraft story, Colour Out of Space. So yeah, I think if you go into this not expecting too much, it's quite an enjoyable film. It is of its time, but I do like all that old psychedelic grooviness. It works well, the performances are all good. The plot is pretty solid as it goes. There's no major sort of clunky bits that I could spot or anything else. And I think for its day, this is a pretty good effort. Re-Animator. This is a 1985 movie made by Stuart Gordon, produced by Brian Yuzna, starring Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West, Barbara Crampton as Megan Halsey, and Bruce Abbott as Daniel Kane. This, of course, is based on Lovecraft's Herbert West Re-Animator, which I suppose was Lovecraft's attempt at a Frankenstein story. This is more weird science than mythos. Herbert West is a scientist who is annoyed by death. It frustrates him. So he sets his life's work to inventing a way to reanimate the dead by use of a particular serum, that lovely fluorescent green serum that we see in the film. Of course, it all goes horribly wrong, and his creations wreak revenge at the end, much like the original Frankenstein. From there, well, it's the very broad outlines of the plot, I suppose. It doesn't really stick to the original in any great way. But we have a young Dr. West who's come over to the States, to Arkham, from Europe, where he's involved in some sort of scandal. And here he's continuing his research into reviving the deceased. He house shares with Daniel Kane, and it's not long before Herbert is injecting stuff, including the unfortunate cat who gets it. Yes, sorry about that, the cat does get it. And he draws Daniel into his work. Now, Daniel's girlfriend is Megan Halsey, who is the daughter of the dean. So when she gets involved, the situation becomes worse for the students because of course, Dean Halsey is not keen of what's going on. And West also comes into conflict with Dr. Hill, played marvellously by David Gale, who's sort of working along maybe similar lines to West, but is more interested in mind control, which plays a big part in the plot as it develops. So yeah, the stage is set for really what I suppose you would call a gore fest. This being the 80s, the depiction of blood and gore is extremely graphic, and I believe they use something like 100 litres of blood for the whole thing, whereas a normal horror film, the total was around 7 or 8 litres. So yeah, lots of blood, lots of gore. We do get a bit of sex in there as well, of course, particularly in one rather controversial scene that involves Dr. Hill's disembodied head. That's all I'm going to say about that. The cast in this are excellent, I think, throughout. Great performances. And of course, Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton in particular went on to make many other Lovecraft films as well. In fact, Jeffrey Combs even played H.P. Lovecraft in the film Necronomicon. And Barbara Crampton is still acting as well. In fact, last year, 2023, she starred in a film called Suitable Flesh, also based on a Lovecraft story, The Thing on the Doorstep. And by all accounts, originally, this film was played pretty straight when it was first written. But as they started filming it, more and more humour started to creep in. And I think that humour is the making of this film. To be sure, it's a very dark humour, but I think it works very well. This is something we talk about quite often on the podcast, is there is far more humour in Lovecraft and his associates than people might think. People tend to think of him as being very po-faced, if you'll forgive the pun, quite a dull sort of guy. But when you read the correspondence between all these people, they were having fun. They were making up names, putting each other in each other's stories, and all the rest of it. So I think the two things that Re-Animator does capture from Lovecraft is that element of dark humour, and also, of course, without giving the ending away, that bleakness as well. Dagon is also a Stuart Gordon film from 2001. It stars Ezra Gotti as Paul Marsh and Raquel Morono as Barbara. This, of course, is an adaptation of Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth. And again, it's updated to the modern day. And again, there are some plot changes in this, but I feel that the general theme of this is very much the same as the Shadow over Innsmouth. We have two couples on a yacht just off the coast of Spain. They're hit by a sudden storm. One woman is injured and trapped on the boat, so the other couple decide to get in the dinghy and row to the nearby fishing village that they can see in order to get help. And I mentioned atmosphere earlier, and I think this film certainly succeeds on that score. In fact, the very opening scene is an aquatic dream that the main character is having, which starts off quite nice, and then a mermaid appears, but it turns out she's got like shark's teeth, and it all goes very horrible very quickly. So even the opening sequence, we're in that sort of Lovecraftian, slightly dreamy state. And then when we get into the village itself, which is called Imboca, because we're in Spain, Boca, of course, is Spanish for mouth, then the place looks like Innsmouth, and the people there, oh yes, they've definitely got the Innsmouth look. So the story develops with the locals not being too friendly, and our protagonist ends up getting chased, finds himself in a tannery. There's all sorts of stuff hanging up, including, disturbingly, what looks like some human skin. And in fact, he finds his friend from the boat hanging up as well. So we know that things are going south. We know we're not in Kansas anymore. In the Shadow over Innsmouth story, we get a lot of exposition from Zadok Allen, the town drunk. We get the same here. We get a character called Ezekiel, who's played marvellously by Spanish film veteran Francesco Rabal. I believe this was his last film, his last performance, and it certainly is a memorable one. In fact, again in this, the acting and the casting is all very good. One of the things the film was criticised for when it came out, apparently, by certain reviewers was it was too dark, it was too bleak. But again, for me, this is Lovecraft, so of course it's going to be dark and bleak. And I sort of like these stories where people think they're in a bad position and then it gets worse. And they think, oh no, it can't get any worse than this, can it? But then it does. So it is this kind of relentless build-up of pressure and tension until the ending. Again, I'm not going to reveal the twist at the end, but if you read The Shadow over Innsmouth, you'll have an inkling of what's coming. But it's done very nicely. The gradual build-up of tension works very well. And of course, we get various reveals along the way of, well, the locals. Let's say they're in various stages of advancement along the Innsmouth look. Some are pretty human, some are definitely not. The big creature we see at the end, well, it's called Dagon in the movie, which is a little different from the story. That's slightly disappointing because I think they went with a CGI creature for that. And at this stage, 2001, CGI was okay, but certainly nothing like it is today. So that was a slight disappointment. But aside from that, heaps of atmosphere, lots of tension, and yeah, a really good depiction of Innsmouth. The Thing is a 1982 movie directed by John Carpenter, starring Kurt Russell as Macready. The screenplay was by Bill Lancaster. Now, this is where I'm having a bit of a cheat because, as I said, I'm really looking at Lovecraft films that are based squarely on Lovecraft stories. I had to put The Thing in here because, well, it's one of the best horror films ever. And even if it's not directly based on a Lovecraft story, it is totally Lovecraftian. Having said that, we know that The Thing was very much based on a 1951 movie called The Thing from Another World. That in turn was based on a 1938 story written by John W. Campbell called Who Goes There, about an Antarctic expedition. Now, there is some speculation that Campbell was heavily influenced by Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, which is exactly the same setting. And that was written in 1931. So it is possible to draw this line. It is, and I'm sticking to it, from At the Mountains of Madness through to Who Goes There, through to those two movies. And of course, as we know, John Carpenter was a great Lovecraft fan anyway. So even if Campbell drew no influence from At the Mountains of Madness, Carpenter certainly did. And he went on to make a couple more Lovecraftian films. In the Mouth of Madness is a prime example. So we're at a US research station in Antarctica, and we get a dog running towards the base, being chased by a helicopter. Helicopter, it turns out, is from another nearby base that's Norwegian. And they start taking pot shots at the dog. The American guys think this is a bit odd. When they come out to see what's happening, the helicopter has landed. One of the Norwegians points a gun at one of the American guys, and, you know, things deteriorate from there. And of course, what happens is they take this poor little doggy, all shivering and cold and on his own, they take him into the base and put him into their own kennels. As it happens, the dog is carrying the thing. What we get from here is a masterpiece of paranoia, claustrophobia, tension, terror, and horror. Now, I say terror and horror because we have the terror of the situation of not knowing who is who and what is what. But then we also get the very visual horror as well of the various incarnations of the thing in all sorts of gruesome and grisly ways, some of them extremely inventive. And this is one of those few movies where people are actually going, oh no, really? Considering the time, and this was all real-time effects, it's an amazing achievement. And I believe about $1.5 million of the budget purely went on creating the creature. Again, pre-CGI, which I think makes it more real in a way. I think nowadays we're kind of spoiled. I watched the Doctor Strange film, a little while ago now, and there's so much amazing stuff happening, but it leaves me a little bit untouched. Whereas when you see an upside down head actually sprout spider legs and scuttle away, that's visceral, you know, that's real. And yet on its release, the film got pretty poor reviews. I think it was described as instant junk, amongst many other things. Now, part of that may be because it came out in 1982, the same time as E.T. So, can you imagine two more contrasting depictions of alien life? The cuddly little home home and this thing. Maybe that was something to do with it. Uh, Again, it highlights for me that bleakness of Lovecraft, particularly with the ending and the fact that this thing has come to our planet. There's no attempt to communicate. We don't know how it got here. We don't know what it is or where it's from. It's just out and out relentless horror. The Call of Cthulhu is a 2005 movie created by Sean Branney and Andrew Lehman of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. It stars Matt Foyer as Francis Wayland Thurston, and Chad Pfeiffer from the H.P. Podcraft appears as Henry Wilcox. So the HPLHS is a group or a society that's set up to honour the works of Lovecraft. They produce books, films, audio dramas, props for gaming, all sorts of stuff. Again, I'll put their link down below. If you haven't visited their site, then please do go. If you're a Lovecraft fan, there's a ton of stuff there that will interest you. Now, the genius with this film is that it's made in mythoscope. The creators took the excellent idea of thinking, well, Call of Cthulhu was written in the 1920s, so let's make the film as though it were the 1920s. In other words, it's a silent movie. This straight away, I think, frees them up from a lot of budgetary constraints. Everything can be done in-house on quite simple but effective sets, and the big C, when we do get to see him, the big reveal at the end, it's like a 1920s stop motion, reminding me a bit of King Kong. And in the context of the film, it works beautifully. Call of Cthulhu, of course, is Lovecraft's really big central mythos story, and it details this sort of disparate investigation into what turns out to be a global network of cults, all worshipping or in contact with the great Cthulhu, who lies not dead but dreaming under the sea in the sunken city of Urlye in the Pacific. And I have to say, of all the adaptations, this is the most faithful to the story. It captures all the major beats of the story, it captures the atmosphere in the story, and all the themes. And I mentioned the idea of action before, so as I said, we see that in The Shadow over Innsmouth, we get that in Dagon. We get certain sort of action scenes here, and they're done very well. Two of my favourites, Inspector Legrasse and the visit to the Louisiana swamps, where there's a huge Cthulhu ritual going on. That was very, very good. And the other scene I like is when the sailors discover Rillier at the end of the film, and they're trying to get their heads around this non-Euclidean place, the architecture, the stonework. Now, how do you depict non-Euclidean in a film? That's quite a challenge, particularly in a 1920s silent movie. But these guys do it really well. We get a scene where the sailors are clambering around all these rocks and stones, and one of them sort of disappears into a corner. And you sort of think, how did they do that? I'm still trying to work out how they did that. I think perhaps there was dark sorcery involved. But anyway, the effect is great and really gives you this impression of nothing here is quite as it should be. Great performances all round from the whole cast, and an excellent score as well, which of course is doubly important for a silent movie. So yeah, without a doubt to my mind, the best single adaptation of Lovecraft in movie or TV for that matter. In fact, this has got a 100% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's still lauded today as the top Lovecraft adaptation, and rightly so. There we go then, my top 5 Lovecraft films, including one that's maybe a bit of a cheat, but not even a stick of dynamite is going to budge me on that one. Of course, there are many others that could have made this list, in particular Corman's The Haunted Palace, which was the case of Charles Dexter Ward. I mean, Vincent Price, say no more. We have From Beyond, which followed Re-Animator, pretty much in the same kind of vein, if you pardon that pun again. There was a German film called Die Farbe, which was an adaptation of The Colour Out of Space. That's very good. And again, that was done in black and white. The only colour part in it was the colour, which I thought was very good, very effective idea. And not that long ago, we had an actual adaptation of The Colour Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage, of course. To be honest, I've only watched it once. Maybe I need to go back and revisit that again. I thought it was good. That's damning with faint praise, isn't it? But I don't think, well, as you can see, it didn't make my top five. I've got an idea that the same team might be looking at doing the Dunwich Horror, so that would be interesting to see. I do like that 1970s version, as I said. There was another version made in the early 2000s, I think, also starring Dean Stockwell, also called the Dunwich Horror. It had a few alternative names. Don't bother. Well, unless you're really bored and want something to watch. It's not a patch on the original, and it takes it even further away from Lovecraft. As always, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. What's your top Lovecraft film? Do you think there's a film that has really captured the essence of Lovecraft? Do you think it's even possible to do so? Do let me know in the comments below. As always, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe. And yeah, just take care if you're visiting Innsmouth, eh?